In this screencast on biodiversity, I will be looking at the causes of declining global biodiversity, and the 5 factors can be remembered with the acronym HIPCO, HIPCO. And each of these factors has an underlying situation, which is that they are all caused by human activity. So the H stands for habitat loss, but it also includes not only habitat loss, but habitat degradation and fragmentation. The second cause, the I, stands for invasive species, which are species that were not historically present in a particular ecosystem, and once they've moved in, they start taking over and causing the other native species to not be able to compete. The P stands for pollution. It could be air, water, and soil. C stands for climate change. Even a very small change in temperature can affect certain species, particularly things like coral, which are affected by a 2-degree change. And the O stands for overharvesting. So that's when a species is harvested or killed or harvested faster than that species can reproduce. So let's look at those factors. First is habitat loss. And that's the number one cause of declining biodiversity, particularly in the United States, but also globally. Habitat loss includes things like deforestation, for example. And it also includes habitat degradation, where perhaps a human community has been built, and so there is still some habitat, but it's been degraded. And habitat fragmentation, which means that species can no longer roam over the entirety of what used to be their habitat for mating or searching for food or nesting. For most species, the greatest cause of biodiversity decline and extinction is habitat loss. And most habitat loss is due to human impacts. Of course, you can have natural events causing habitat loss, such as fires or a hurricane. But mainly what we're talking about here is human-caused habitat loss. So let's look at 2 examples here. On the left, the Indian tiger, and on the right, the black rhino. These examples are from a different textbook by Miller. And in the left-hand diagram, you can see that the Indian tiger used to have a range 100 years ago of this bluish-purple range. Quite a considerable range. The range today, though, is just these little dark red sections. So if you have Indian tiger population living here, it's extremely unlikely they're going to be able to mate with, say, an Indian tiger here or an Indian tiger here, because that is just there's too much space here that's been interrupted with roads and human habitation. So not only are you going to have a smaller range for looking for food sources, you're going to have a much smaller range looking for mates. And that's going to lead to inbreeding depression and offspring that are either less capable of surviving or aren't even produced in the first place. The example over here of Africa and the black rhino is kind of similar. Huge range in 1700, about half the continent, or at least a third of the continent. And look at the range today, very tiny little isolated pockets. And again, this pocket here, this population might mate with that population, but they're certainly going to be isolated from that population, which is isolated from that population. Okay, the second cause of declining biodiversity is invasive species. So first, let's look at some vocabulary terms. First, alien species and exotic species. Those are equivalent terms. An alien or exotic species is one that has not historically lived in a particular range, but is now living outside their historical range. And that's not necessarily a harmful thing. That doesn't necessarily cause declining biodiversity. But when an alien or an exotic species spreads so rapidly across a particular area, because they usually don't have predators and they're fast reproducers, high reproductive capacity, lots of new food sources for them, then the alien or exotic species becomes an invasive species. So I'm going to give you a few examples. You can read more about it in your book. And as part of your open response, you will be asked to give examples of invasive species. So I'll provide you with a couple now. You need to be able to identify the species, where it is now living, how it was brought there, which may be accidentally or on purpose, and what the environmental impact of that was. So one example here is the kudzu vine, which was imported from Japan to help prevent erosion. And it's a vine, so it grows rapidly and quite an entanglement and does help with erosion prevention. Unfortunately, it doesn't have natural predators in the United States, and therefore it grows uncontrollably. In fact, the more you cut it, the more it just multiplies. That doesn't help. Kind of like bamboo. You cut it down, and that only makes it spread more. So that's an example of an invasive species, and that was introduced on purpose. In the next picture here on the right, we have zebra mussels, which were brought, I believe, from Asia in the ballast of ships. And when ships came into port, the St. Lawrence River, they emptied their ballast, and as a result, they emptied these zebra mussels into the waterways. And that's now continued not only the St. Lawrence River, but into the Great Lakes. And these zebra mussels outcompete with the natural mussels that are there. And they grow like crazy, and they clog up sewage drainage pipes, and they are covering ships, and they're really doing a lot of damage environmentally, and also to the species that they're displacing. I'm going to move forward here to gypsy moth, which was brought into Massachusetts by a scientist who was going to use these gypsy moths to make silk. So kind of like silkworms, these moths have a silk-like extrusion. And it turned out, though, that the gypsy moth silk was not good for producing silk cloth. And so he had given up on the idea. And here we don't know what happened, whether it was accidental or on purpose, but they escaped his lab where he was working, or they were let out the door, and they took over in the Northeast. And now they don't have very many predators. There is a fungus that, under the proper weather conditions, will do in the gypsy moths. But when we have consecutive drier years, then these gypsy moths have taken over. You might be aware of them in your neighborhood, and they eat the trees, particularly in the forest of the Northeast. And the last one is not in your book at all, but I think it's one of the most interesting, I guess we could call it that, examples of an invasive species that was brought into America on purpose without understanding what the consequences would be. So there was a man who lived in New York City who was a big William Shakespeare fan, and he decided to import birds from England that were mentioned in any of Shakespeare's plays. And so one of them was starlings, and he released these birds into Central Park. And it wasn't a large number. I want to say something in the range of 25 starlings. And they took over like crazy, and now they're in huge flocks. I know they're as far down south as Maryland, because we used to have just, tons and tons of them flying through the skies in the summer. And they really take over. They produce a lot of excrement, and they've really taken over. Fortunately, they're not here that I've ever seen on Cape Cod or even in Massachusetts, but they're quite a nuisance bird.